Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland and I'm on Bloomsbury Square in London. So I'm going to talk about the Bloomsbury Set because they took their name from this part of London, and Bloomsbury Square gives its name to this area just north of New Oxford Street, just to the west of Holborn, just to the south of Euston Road certainly, and what would bound it to the west, I'm trying to think, possibly Regent Street, but that's getting over to Fitzrovia that way. So the Bloomsbury Set was an informal group of intellectuals of progressive views, both artistic and politically progressive, who rose to prominence right at the end of the 19th century, and they lasted into the mid-20th century. I say they were this informal circle because there was no membership list of it. You didn't apply to be a member of it, so there's no roll of who's actually in it. It's all very approximate who you consider to have been in it, and there's no exact beginning date or a date when it dissolved. It gradually faded away by the 1950s as most of the original Bloomsbury Set had died. So they were men and women who were really avant-garde in their artistic tastes and progressive in their political opinions, and they espoused views which were often regarded as scandalous at the time but would now be viewed as entirely mainstream, like gender equality, and they were heterosocial but not always heterosexual. So they believed that men and women could mingle on an equal footing without it being like a ball or a view to finding somebody to marry, and indeed they considered it entirely ethically acceptable for a couple to live together when they weren't married, to have children together when they weren't married, although few of them actually did that. They thought that homosexuality was permissible and ought to be legalized, and going back way to the 1890s, that was shocking for most of society. Remember, the death penalty for buggery had only been abolished in 1861, and homosexual acts were only decriminalized in England and Wales in 1967. What else? Believing in racial equality. They believed that all men and women ought to have the right to vote, and things like that. They often embraced the cause of decolonization. A few of them were pacifists, and some of them believed that elective abortion ought to be permitted. A few of them were vegetarians. Some of them called for animal rights to be observed and respected, things like that. Some of them in the Liberal Party. They tended to join the Labour Party. A few of them were communists, anarchists. I think it's fair to say none of them were conservative. So often they were against Christianity, certainly didn't believe in Christianity, and they were atheists and flirted with some Eastern religions like Buddhism, Hinduism and so forth. So they tended to come from upper middle class or indeed aristocratic families, and they belonged to the leisured classes. They professed their sympathy for the plight of the proletariat, and some of them wanted a revolution by force of arms, others not, by moral force. So who were some of the luminaries of the Bloomsbury Set? Well, it would be George Bernard Shaw, it would be the novelist Virginia Woolf, and obviously she was bisexual. She had mental health issues, eventually committed suicide, and she lived around here, of course. She was born into a very affluent family, writing to the Lighthouse, and a modernist novelist, where it's really the plot doesn't matter. So not the storyline, it's really the characterization and the description is what counts. Lytton Strachey, this waspish writer whose eminent Victorians was a hatchet job on many of the household gods of middle-class Britain at the time, saying that their reputations were hugely overblown and ought to be reassessed and ought to be held in contempt. So who else? Oh, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, who was also bisexual, had to keep that quiet. And he was a member of the Liberal Party, given pressing invitations to stand for Parliament as a Liberal, but always turned them down. And my goodness, I'm trying to say, well, the Sitwells, I suppose, Sacheverell Sitwell, Isadora Duncan, and there must be more, but they're not springing to mind right now. So many of the novelists, poets, artists of this time. I mean, Ezra Pound, although he's American, came along. He socialized them a little bit, but then he turned out to be a fascist. George Orwell was not really regarded as being part of the group. He'd be a bit younger than most of them, only been born in 1903. They're almost all born in the 19th century. And although he was from a middle-class family, which at a stretch enabled him to go to Eton on a scholarship, he didn't hang out with this lot because Although they claimed that they felt great compassion for the labouring classes, that didn't usually mean that they were going to hand over their filthy lucre, and they insisted on living in considerable comfort in this decidedly upscale part of London. What else about the Bloomsbury Set? So that was more or less their geographical centre. I'm just trying to think if there were more people we regard as Irish members of it. A lot of the famous Irish writers, not really, because they weren't, like James Joyce, never hung out here. They visited London a few times. And who's the other bloke who went to Paris waiting for Godot? His name will come back to me. The last modernist, he wasn't a member of the Bloomsbury Set either. D.H. Lawrence, again, although he was had the same outlook on life, he wasn't regarded as one of them because he spent a lot of his adult life abroad in Mexico, the United States and elsewhere, although he was in sympathy with many of their Moors. So that is the Bloomsbury Set, and a quick look around Bloomsbury, which really was their spiritual centre. Okay, so sometime we'll go to the individual houses of some of the luminaries of the Bloomsbury Set. I could give you a more detailed assessment of what they were all about.